The wind reached the valley before Clara Reed did, racing ahead of her wagon like a warning no one bothered to speak out loud. By the time the wheels finally stopped, the cold had already found its way into her bones, and the silence pressed so hard it felt deliberate, as if the land itself was waiting to see how long she would last. Clara stood still for a moment, one gloved hand gripping the wagon rail, the other resting on the shoulder of her eldest son. Lucas, only 9, tried to look brave, but his eyes kept drifting toward the dark line of trees that framed the valley. Emily held Nathan close, whispering to him even though he was too young to understand why his mother's smile looked thinner than it used to. The cabin was worse than Clara had prepared herself for. One wall leaned inward, the roof sagged like a tired back, and the door groaned in protest when she pushed it open. Cold air rushed out, as if the place had been holding its breath all these years. Clara stepped inside first, instinctively placing herself between the children and whatever waited there. Dust covered the floor. The hearth was cracked. The windows rattled even without wind. This was all she had left. Her husband had died the previous spring, taken by an illness that arrived quietly and left nothing behind but debt and unfinished plans. Staying was never an option. The valley, harsh as it looked, had promised land and a chance to work for herself. Clara had believed that effort and care could make a home out of almost anything. Standing in that cabin, she wondered how much belief winter would allow. The neighbors came quickly, drawn by curiosity more than kindness. They watched from a distance at first, as if she were a test they did not want to fail themselves. By the second day, Wilbur Crane rode up on a gray horse, his face lined by years of cold and certainty. He did not dismount right away. "You'll need firewood," he said, his voice calm, almost practiced. "More than you think. 8 cords if you want a chance." Clara nodded, already doing the math in her head. 8 cords meant months of work. It meant strength she did not have and time she could not spare. Wilbur's eyes moved to the children, then back to her hands. "A woman alone can't manage that," he added. He didn't sound cruel. He sounded sure. Thomas Brooks stood a little behind him, quiet, watching without judgment. He said nothing, but his silence carried weight of its own. Others murmured agreement. Some looked away, already convinced they were witnessing a mistake. That night, the temperature dropped fast. Clara lay awake on the hard bed, listening to the wind slip through every crack. Lucas coughed in his sleep. Nathan whimpered and turned restlessly. Emily pressed her cold feet against her mother's legs, seeking warmth without asking for it. Clara stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside her. Not panic, but clarity. The rules of this valley had been written by men who had never stood awake all night counting breaths. They spoke of tradition as if it were protection, but tradition did not sit with sick children in the dark. Tradition did not care who survived. By morning, frost clung to the inside of the windows. Clara wrapped her scarf tighter and stepped outside, studying the cabin from every angle. She imagined the coming snow, the long walks for wood, the moments when leaving the house would mean choosing between warmth and safety. Each image ended the same way: loss. Wilbur passed by again later, pointing out trees to cut, distances to haul. Clara listened politely, thanked him, and watched as he rode off, convinced the valley had already decided her fate. She looked down at her children, their faces red from the cold, their trust unbroken. Clara Reed understood then that survival would not come from working harder within rules designed for someone else. If she followed them, winter would take what little she had left. Standing there, with the wind pulling at her coat and the valley watching in silence, Clara made a quiet decision. She would not ask permission. She would not wait for approval. She would change the rules, or lose everything trying. By late spring, Clara Reed stopped listening to advice and started listening to the quiet thoughts she trusted more. The valley had settled into its routine, Men cutting trees from dawn to dusk. Women mending, cooking, waiting. Clara watched it all with calm eyes, but her mind worked in a different direction. Each trip outside for firewood in winter would steal heat from the house and strength from her children. The math was simple, and it frightened her. The idea came to her one afternoon as she stood beside the cabin, rain soaking the ground and turning stacked wood dark and heavy. She imagined winter snow doing the same, imagined Lucas struggling to pull frozen logs through drifts taller than him. Clara placed her hand against the cabin wall and pictured another wall, then another, not for living space, but for shelter. A place where wood could stay dry. A place where fire could be fed without stepping into danger. She sketched that night by lamplight, lines rough but clear. A covered woodshed built around the cabin itself. Close. Practical. Always within reach. The next morning, she took the drawing with her into town. Father Samuel Gray studied it slowly, his fingers resting on the edge of the paper. His voice stayed gentle, almost kind. "People survive here because they respect what has always worked," he said. "Changing that can lead to trouble." Clara nodded, respectful, but she noticed he did not say it would fail, only that it was unfamiliar. Dr. Henry Mills frowned as he looked over the sketch. He tapped the page once, then again. "Fire near the house increases risk," he said calmly. "If something goes wrong, help will be too far away." His concern sounded reasonable. It always did. At the general store, Martha Caldwell didn't bother to hide her doubt. "Lumber costs money," she said. "You'll run out before winter even starts." Her words were polite, but her eyes were already measuring Clara for failure. Clara thanked them all. She listened. She asked no one for permission. By the end of the week, she had spent nearly everything she owned on boards, nails, and borrowed tools. The children watched as supplies were stacked beside the cabin instead of firewood. Lucas asked careful questions. Careful. Emily trusted without asking. Nathan copied everything his brother did, serious and determined. Neighbors slowed their horses to stare. Some laughed openly, others shook their heads. "She should be cutting wood," they said. "She won't make it." Clara worked steadily. She did not rush, and she did not explain herself. Her hands blistered and healed. The children carried small boards and held nails, proud to be useful. Each evening, Clara studied the structure, adjusting angles, checking airflow, thinking ahead to storms that had not yet arrived. Doubt came quietly. It waited until night, until exhaustion made questions louder. Clara wondered if she had misunderstood the valley, if the warnings had been right. She imagined winter arriving early, imagined empty shelves and cold rooms. But every time fear rose, she looked at her children sleeping close together and returned to work the next morning. People continued to offer advice she did not ask for. Some spoke kindly, others spoke as if they were already offering condolences. Clara answered all of them the same way, with a calm smile that revealed nothing. Thomas Brooks stopped by often, bringing extra nails or offering to hold a beam steady. He never argued. He never praised. He simply helped and left. His quiet presence made the work easier, though neither of them spoke about it. By midsummer, the structure had taken shape. The cabin stood wrapped in protection, wood stored close and dry, paths short and safe. When Dr. Mills returned to look again, he walked the length of the shed slowly. He tested the airflow, checked the distance from the stove, and said nothing for a long moment. "It's well thought out," he admitted finally. Winter was still months away, but the valley had already chosen sides. Some waited for Clara's failure. Others watched with growing unease. Clara kept building, knowing she had risked everything not on tradition, but on thought. And there would be no turning back. Summer did not wait for approval. It moved forward with long days and short patience, and Clara Reed worked inside its rhythm as if time itself were watching her. The shed around the cabin grew board by board, not quickly, but steadily. While other families spent their mornings cutting and stacking firewood in distant clearings, Clara stayed close to home, hammer in hand, eyes always returning to the horizon. The valley noticed. People rode past more often now, slowing just enough to count how little firewood she had piled. Whispers followed her name. Some said she was stubborn. Others said she was afraid of hard work. Clara heard none of it directly, but the weight of those judgments settled into the air all the same. Lucas tried to help more than his small frame allowed. Clara had to stop him more than once, guiding him gently away from lifting beams that were too heavy. Emily swept and organized scraps, turning disorder into neat piles. Nathan followed them both, serious and quiet, copying every movement as if this work were a lesson he needed to learn early. As the walls of the shed rose, so did the doubts, not just from the valley, but from inside Clara herself. On certain evenings, when the sun dipped low and the wind cooled fast, she would sit on the steps and study what she had built. It looked solid. It made sense. And yet the fear crept in anyway. What if they were right? That question followed her into sleep and waited for her when she woke. She had traded certainty for possibility, tradition for design. It was a moral choice as much as a practical one. If she failed, the valley would say she deserved it for stepping outside her place. Worse, her children would pay the price. The unexpected moment came one afternoon when the sky darkened without warning. A sudden storm rolled through the valley, heavy rain slamming against the new boards. Clara rushed to secure loose pieces while the children huddled inside. Water streamed down the shed walls, but none reached the stacked wood. It stayed dry, protected. As Clara worked, a memory surfaced without invitation. Her husband, standing beside her years earlier, holding a broken fence post and laughing softly. He had always believed problems could be solved if someone bothered to think differently. When others followed habit, he asked questions. When others warned him not to, he tried anyway. He had trusted her judgment completely. The memory hit harder than the rain. Clara froze for a moment, hammer lowered, heart tight. She realized then that this shed was not just a structure. It was a continuation of a promise she had made long before the valley ever knew her name, that she would protect her family, even if it meant standing alone. The storm passed as quickly as it came. The children emerged, wide-eyed but unharmed. Clara finished securing the last board with renewed purpose. Doubt did not disappear, but it no longer controlled her. Thomas Brooks arrived later that week, leading his horse slowly. He studied the shed in silence, walking its length, checking the way the roof angled away from the cabin. "It'll hold," he said finally. It wasn't praise, it was assurance. Dr. Henry Mills returned soon after, his visit more formal this time. He inspected the spacing, the ventilation, the distance from the stovepipe. He tested airflow with his hand and frowned, not in disapproval, but in thought. "You've reduced risk by limiting exposure," he said. "You stay inside. The heat stays inside." It was the first time anyone had spoken of her work without warning attached. Still, winter crept closer. The mornings cooled. Frost appeared on the ground. The valley's laughter softened into quiet watching. Clara noticed fewer comments, fewer confident predictions of failure. That silence carried its own pressure. Each evening, Clara counted the days left before snow. She calculated again and again, measuring what she had built against what she had not done. The shed was finished. The wood was dry. But the stacks were smaller than anyone else's. She made her choice daily, recommitting to it every time she closed the shed door. This was not about proving the valley wrong. It was about choosing thought over fear, planning over habit. When the first hard wind of fall swept through the valley, the shed did not move. The boards held. Clara stood inside, listening, knowing winter was no longer an unknown enemy, but a test she had chosen to face her own way. The storm announced itself with a silence that felt wrong. One morning, the valley woke under a sky so pale it looked empty, and the air pressed down hard and still. Clara Reed noticed it first, when the stove burned hotter than usual, and the sound of the outside world seemed to disappear. She kept the children close that day, watching the light fade hours earlier than it should have. By nightfall, the wind arrived. It did not howl at first. It pushed. Snow followed soon after, thick and heavy, striking the walls again and again. Clara fed the stove steadily, calm on the outside, counting each movement the way she always did when fear tried to rise. By morning, the world beyond the windows no longer existed. Snow had climbed past the glass. The door was sealed tight by drifts. The temperature dropped so fast Clara felt it even near the fire. She did not open the door to look. She did not need to. This was the storm the valley had spoken of in quiet voices. Lucas grew sick that same day. At first it was a cough. Then he stopped asking questions. His skin grew hot. His eyes dull. Clara knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his forehead, keeping her voice steady as she spoke to him. Leaving the cabin was not an option. Even if she could open the door, the wind would take the heat in seconds. Emily watched in silence, holding Nathan close, understanding more than her age allowed. Clara made a choice without speaking it aloud. She would not leave her son. She would not leave any of them. The shed made that possible. She opened the small interior door and reached for dry wood stacked neatly within arm's reach. No snow touched her boots. No wind cut at her face. She fed the stove again and again, keeping the fire alive through the long hours. The walls of the shed absorbed the worst of the cold. The cabin stayed warm enough to matter. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Snow rose higher than the roofline. The wind battered the structure, testing every nail and board. Clara listened closely, alert to any change in sound. The shed held. Time lost its shape. Day and night blended together. Clara counted breaths instead of hours. Lucas drifted in and out of sleep. She cooled his forehead with water, whispered stories he remembered from better days. She spoke softly, not because she believed it cured anything, but because fear listened, and she refused to let it hear her voice. At one point, the stove burned low while she rested her head against the bed frame. Panic sparked for just a second before discipline took over. Clara stood, reached into the shed, and fed the fire without opening the outer door. Heat returned. Control returned. Elsewhere in the valley, others were not so fortunate. Clara did not know that yet. She did not know who struggled or who waited in darkness. All she knew was the steady rhythm of survival inside four walls and a structure no one else had trusted. On the third day, the wind began to weaken. The pounding softened. Snow fell lighter. Clara noticed first because the shed stopped shuddering. She waited. She did not rush. When the silence finally settled again, it was different from before. This silence felt finished. Lucas stirred that afternoon and asked for water. Clara nearly cried, but she did not. She smiled, nodded, and handed him the cup with steady hands. Emily let out a breath she had been holding too long. Nathan climbed onto the bed, careful and quiet, as if the storm might still hear him. When Clara finally opened the outer door, snow stood nearly as high as her shoulders. The valley looked broken and unfamiliar, buried under white and still. She closed the door quickly, returning to warmth without hesitation. They had survived, not because of strength alone, not because of luck, but because Clara had built a way to stay inside when leaving would have cost too much. As night fell again, gentler this time, she fed the stove once more and sat beside her children, knowing the worst had passed, and that the valley would never look at her the same way again. Spring returned to the valley slowly, as if unsure it was welcome. The snow pulled back day by day, revealing fences bent by weight, paths that had vanished, and cabins that stood quiet longer than they should have. Clara Reed stepped outside and felt the ground soften beneath her boots. For the first time in months, the air carried no threat. People came to her homestead without announcing themselves. They stood near the shed, touching the boards, looking at the narrow doors and the way the structure wrapped the cabin. No one laughed. No one offered advice. The valley had learned to speak more carefully. Wilbur Crane arrived one morning and removed his hat before he spoke. "I was wrong," he said simply. Clara nodded. She did not ask for more. The words were enough. Soon, the sound of hammers spread across the valley. Cabins gained their own shelters. Covered sheds rose where open stacks once stood. What had been called foolish became common sense. No one claimed the idea as their own. Everyone knew where it had started. Martha Caldwell stopped Clara in the store one afternoon, her tone softer than before. You saved more than your family," she said. "You changed how we think." Clara thanked her and moved on, uncomfortable with praise. She had not built the shed to lead anyone. She had built it to survive. Dr. Henry Mills visited next, this time without notes or warnings. He walked the structure again, slower now, and smiled once. "Preparation matters," he said. "You proved that." It was the closest he came to an apology. Thomas Brooks became a constant presence, helping others build, offering quiet guidance. Over time, his visits to Clara's homestead lasted longer. Conversations stretched. Shared work turned into shared meals. There was no sudden moment, no dramatic promise. Just two people choosing not to be alone anymore. They married the following year, not in the church, but outside, with the valley watching. Clara stood strong, her children beside her, the shed behind them like a silent witness to what had begun it all. Years passed. Winters still came hard, but fewer families suffered for it. Children grew up knowing that shelter could be improved, that old rules could be questioned. Clara's design became tradition, taught without argument, passed down without her name attached. She never corrected anyone. On quiet evenings, Clara would sit by the stove and listen to the steady sound of wood burning. The shed creaked softly as it always had, a reminder of the season that changed everything. She thought of the woman who arrived in the valley with nothing but fear and children who trusted her completely. The valley had tested her. She had answered with thought instead of surrender. When strangers passed through and asked how such a harsh place had learned to endure, no one spoke of luck. They spoke of preparation. They spoke of courage that looked ordinary until it mattered. And somewhere in the valley, a fire burned safely inside, protected by a simple idea that proved one quiet truth. Sometimes, survival belongs to the one who dares to think differently and builds before the storm arrives.